Hey everyone, thanks for joining. John here. We have Josh Bedi for the third time. A new and exciting topic today. Thanks for taking the time, Josh. Recently, we talked about um, a public choice explanation of caste. And I know Josh originally from our studies together at George Mason University. But since that last video, Josh has done some work with the Pioneer Institute, including co-authoring a report that we're going to talk about today. So I want to turn it over to Josh to kind of describe what is the Pioneer Institute, how did you get involved with them, and a little bit about your co-author.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. And so I recently started working with Pioneer Institute. They're the guy that runs it, Jim Sturgios. He sent me an email, um, asking if I wanted to help them out with a little bit of looking at immigration, immigrant entrepreneurship specifically. Well-established think tank in Massachusetts. And they do a lot of stuff with like school choice. They've started doing research with COVID. They do a lot of research on policy issues like transportation. And so it's a pro-market think tank, and they wanted to get into these immigration issues a little bit more. And so they contacted me. The rest of the stuff I'm going to do with them is going to involve kind of measuring the extent of immigrant entrepreneurship in New England, looking at things like how barriers stifle that immigrant entrepreneurship. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we have COVID related, immigration related, school choice, public choice. That seems pretty across the board. So the orientation of the Institute is more free market across the board instead of like this or that particular issue. Is that fair?
Yeah. They're pretty consistently market oriented, you could say.
Could you say a bit about Aiden and what was his role? Is there a certain skill set or expertise that he brought to this report? Is he just sort of a veteran with the Institute and he helped kind of the formal kind of structure of it, or what was that give and take between you and Aiden?
Yeah, so he's a research associate with Pioneer Institute. Um, and yeah, I mean that's a good way to describe it. He structured it. He provided a lot of the meat, and I worked more in kind of a you could say like an advisory role, right? I did a lot of editing, some additions to, providing a little bit more of an academic research context.
The report is about 13 pages, I think, of kind of meat. Once you slice off the bibliography and the title page and whatnot. What are your favorite like key highlights there? Yeah, I like the elevator pitch about
So
it.
it's really simple, right? Immigrants were more entrepreneurial than natives, pretty much regardless of how you define entrepreneurship. And at the same time, they experience certain barriers to successfully engaging in entrepreneurship that natives don't. So we have this entrepreneurial differential that's positive for immigrants, even though they have to jump through a lot more hoops than natives do, right? And so the very first part of the paper goes over all the different ways that immigrants are more entrepreneurial, and then the last part of the paper goes over, okay, what are these different barriers that might prevent them from being even more entrepreneurial than they could be.
I think one of the obvious barriers might be language or other cultural barriers. What would be one or two of those positive effects, like a particular?
One example that I like to give to people is patents, because there's some cool research that uses some neat natural experiments to see the contribution of immigrants to patents. And there's this one paper that we cite that looks at sudden deaths among patent creators. So people who are in the process of getting a patent accepted, but they suddenly die. And we look at teams where one member of the patent team is an immigrant, the other is a native. And or not, we don't, but the paper that we cite does. And it turns out that if the immigrant dies, the patent is much less likely to get accepted. But if the native dies, there's no effect.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. So that's a cool, interesting piece of information. But they also contribute disproportionately to business creation, right? And that impact is kind of concentrated. The impact is concentrated in tech industries, right? And these are really impactful types of entrepreneurship, right? Because not all entrepreneurship is created equally. It is certainly important that, your pizza store owners, say, are providing goods and services, but they don't contribute as much to economic output as, say, your Googles or your Amazons. But it turns out that immigrants are more likely to own both types of businesses, or at least to head both types of businesses, right?
That fits with a lot of background knowledge we have about the tech industry as sort of a unique industry. That's a rabbit trail for perhaps a different discussion. One specific question I have, early in the report, you mentioned that 17% of the state workforce, and yet they have started a quarter of all businesses.
Yeah.
Do we have similar stats on a more national basis, or like outside of Massachusetts, even if it is just still New England? Do we know it, kind of what that looks like? And why do we have that piece of data? Is this special reporting that's going on in the state? Or is it like fairly common reporting and we just focus on New England because, as you say, that's like the locus of interest of this think tank?
Yeah, so it's going to be the latter. And in fact, I don't have specific numbers off the top of my head, but I do know from the research that the finding that immigrants are more entrepreneurial than natives is pretty ubiquitous. Wherever you do the study, and even how you define entrepreneurship, right? So we can define entrepreneurship according to patents, and immigrants are more entrepreneurial. We can do it according to business creation, venture capital investment, anything really. And we find that immigration is associated with higher levels of entrepreneurship. And we can study, so there's this global entrepreneurship data set, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And in most of the countries they survey, they find immigrants to be more entrepreneurial than natives. I know I'm at, so my main gig right now is at Copenhagen Business School, and we're looking at administrative data, right? And so this is really fine-grained data. We basically have a data point for anybody who's a resident in Denmark throughout our sample period. And immigrants are more entrepreneurial than natives in this data set too, right? And so very rarely do you find a situation, there are some out there, right, where natives are more entrepreneurial, but it's very rare, right? It's one of the more ubiquitous findings in the academic literature.
Definitely. Thanks. Yeah, I think it's like a super solid finding, and the theory there supports it. The direction of effect is expected. I'm curious about the consistency of magnitudes, because this appears to be, in the case of Massachusetts, depending on how you phrase it, you could rephrase it as like a 50% higher ratio in the population to business formation ratio, something like that, because it's 17 to 25, right? So it's like a 50% difference. Cool. All right. So I think we've covered most of it. Probably two last questions, and thanks again for your time.
Yeah, man.
Looking through the report, it seems to me that it's fairly friendly to the lay reader. Could you confirm that, or maybe that's just my own bias that I've gotten familiar reading more technical things, and then this just feels like a bit of a cakewalk? Could you just confirm if the reports from the Pioneer Institute, maybe in general or in this particular, have a lay audience, and or who is the sort of the usual target reader? Yeah, that would be the question.
Yeah, I think anybody would have an easy time reading this paper, or most people, It is more policy oriented than academic research. And I kind of see this as me going into, kind of dipping my toes into a new type of work, right? I've been really academic oriented so far in my career, however short it has been so far. And I have been interested in doing some more, I'll call it popular writing, right? Writing that's more likely to be read by a normal person, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the case for all of their reports.
Okay.
Now, this is just a literature review. They do have some reports that actually have data in there, and I'm actually working on one right now. But even those, I mean, we're not doing regression analysis, right? We're looking at crosstabs. We're looking at kind of these big level statistics that are kind of intuitive to comprehend, that tell a story, that tell kind of a bigger picture, right? So we're not getting into the weeds like academics like to do.
Okay, great. Um, yeah, that's really cool. So my last question would, well, I mean, the last question will be, is there anything you'd like to add? But my last question in advance is, when it comes to these immigration issues, I think economists, it's one of the few issues that economists from across the board generally support more immigration. And then if you add certain qualifiers, it goes from generally support to unanimously support. If you add a certain qualifier such as high skill or highly educated immigration, then virtually
Mhm.
everyone is like, of course. Um, One of the tensions that I've seen is the conversion of that academic um, agreement into like policy that gets adopted, right? We always see these like political kind of blockers or inhibitions. Um, Last time I checked, anyway. So my question to you is, kind of, what is your take on kind of today's situation? Maybe the new administration has changed things. I don't know. I haven't checked in on these things in I don't know. I'd say a couple of years, probably in any detail. So in terms of political receptivity to freer, more open immigration, or maybe things that are yeah, visa policy. I know you've done a bit of work there, or things that could be adjacent. I don't know how far you want to stretch it. Maybe just trade. Um, what is your take on where we are today versus where we were yesterday, and if you have any speculative thoughts on the future?
Well, so I think this administration is marginally better than the last administration. So I mean, we did see decreases in immigration because of policy for both high skilled and low skilled immigrants under the Trump administration, despite rhetoric from the Trump administration claiming that they want high skilled immigrants, that they want to make it easier for high skilled immigrants to come here. They actually made it more difficult, right?
Yeah,
And some of those, and I want to stress some of those uh, higher restrictions have been removed by the Biden administration, right? But I wouldn't call the Biden administration particularly immigrant friendly, right? I really wouldn't call any U.S. administration up to this point particularly immigrant friendly, at least not any administration after, say, you know, the 20s, right? Uh,
yeah,
I think, I mean, so you make a good point that uh, academics, especially economists, right? Specifically, economists are very pro-immigrant, especially if we're talking about high-skilled immigrants. And I think that you see that general trend in the public too. I think if you ask your standard voter, they would say, "Oh yeah, we want high-skilled immigrants because they help us, because they recognize that these guys found companies like Google and they help create jobs." Um, but they would also say, "We don't want people who are going to come here who are low-skilled." A lot of people complain about or they express the worry about welfare. You know, they're worried that the immigrants are going to take welfare. They're going to drain our resources. Uh, and in turn, I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where it's as easy. Well, maybe we will, but it won't be for a long time. Where it's as easy for a person to travel across borders than it is for, say, a piece of physical capital, right? I mean, throughout the past like 30 years, we've almost removed barriers, all big barriers between peaceful countries when it comes to physical goods, right? But there's a little bit of a lag in freeing up the movement of labor, especially low skilled labor, and even more so middle skilled labor, right? Because most rich country visa policies favor high-skilled immigrants because those are the immigrants people want, and they favor low-skilled immigrants because low-skilled immigrants are more likely to be refugees or asylum seekers, right, from really low-income countries where educational attainment is probably pretty low on average, right? So
Great,
I mean, I'm a
totally.
little hopeful, but it's I don't know. I don't see the median voter changing their opinion too much when it comes to immigration.
Got it. So it's not an easy problem to solve, which is
No.
what I would expect because if it were, it would have been taken care of, yeah, as you say, maybe by the 20s or so. Maybe one thing we can do here, if sort of you're a common voter who has misapprehensions, one of the popular ones, as you point to, is like this myth of job stealing.
Mm-hmm.
If there are issues with the sort of like low information popular voter, maybe the policy changing strategy involves coordinating with like not those people, like more informed voters or even more informed coalitions, like a nonprofit, like maybe the Pioneer Institute.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe they already have like well-informed donors and networks and stuff. So hopefully you're contributing to that.
And they actually, like I'll add, I think they have contributed to actual policy when it comes to school choice,
cool.
right? So I think they have contributed to that in a meaningful way in Massachusetts. So I mean, hopefully, yeah, we can do the same with immigration. That's more of a national issue though than a state issue.
Yeah, it'll be fun. I don't know much about this institute. I'll keep my eye on it. It'll be fun to watch that develop. And then we talked a little bit about the link between physical capital trade and immigration. And I like this notion. I'll check out some data and see how it holds. But at least intuitively, it makes sense that free trade on the physical market could be a leading indicator of openness to free immigration later on. Because as one touch point, we discussed the Trump administration, which just made things much worse for the immigrant. But also supported trade restrictions and the whole fight with China involving tariffs, which, wearing an economist hat, is such a backwards approach. Anyway, thank you again for your time. Very last question. Is there anything you'd like to mention that we haven't touched on? Maybe one thing, I don't know that you have a Twitter. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, not an active one. I keep getting asked, and so maybe I needed to start one. But no, I'm really just on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I have a blog too. I need to write in it more, but my website is joshuakbedi.com. So I blog a little bit on there. I actually started blogging partly because you recommended me do it, because I would have long Facebook posts and you would comment, "This is good for a blog." And so now whenever I get the inkling to complain on Facebook in this really long post, I'll blog instead.
Excellent. Okay, there you go. So for the audience wanting to keep tabs on Josh, there's the blog to refer to. And yeah, depending on your time preference for hearing from Josh, if it's sort of like on an annual basis is good enough, then stick with this channel, because I imagine I'll probably have some reason to talk to Josh over the course of the next year. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, man, I enjoy our conversations. Thanks for having me.